We would like to thank our sponsors for their participation in this year's meeting. Bayer Crop Science, Farm Credit West, Aerobotics, Agri Financial, Fruit Growers Supply, Guardian Harvest, Nicino America, Nielsen Insurance, Pace International, Actigrow, Sinclair, Semios, Sutera, The Zenith Agribusiness Solutions, My Ag Life Daily News Report,
For over 100 years, Farm Credit has supported farmers, ranchers, and rural communities, providing reliable and consistent credit and financial services. We have a dedication to agriculture, and with that comes unique expertise. We understand the challenges and opportunities farmers and ranchers face every day. We speak the same language. Many of our employees grew up in and around agriculture and take pride in developing deep relationships with our customers and communities. As a cooperative, our customers are also our owners, and they in turn shape the service we offer. In addition, that cooperative structure enables us to return profits to those member owners in the form of cash patronage. We are passionate about the farmers of today and the farming of the future. We provide specialized lending and financial advice to young and beginning farmers and sponsor conferences that educate producers about the latest trends. We're also committed to the next generation of farmers by sponsoring 4-H and FFA. After more than 100 years of supporting agriculture, Farm Credit will be with California agriculture every step of the way into the future.
Good morning, and welcome to our virtual 2021 Citrus Showcase. A lot has changed since last year's event, and we could never have imagined that 1 year later we would still be here meeting virtually. We've scaled down today's showcase and focused the event on bringing you a top-notch speaker, followed by a grower panel moderated by our own chairman, Matt Fisher. Today's event wouldn't be possible without the assistance of JCS Marketing and our dedicated sponsors who continue to support your industry through these challenging times. Today's keynote sponsor, Farm Credit West, our marketing panel sponsor, Bayer Crop Science, and all of our showcase sponsors, CGB Agri Financial Services, Nicino America, Sutera, Nielsen Insurance, Fruit Grower Supply, Sinclair Systems International, The Zenith, Pace International, Semios, Guardian Harvest, Aerobotics, and Actigrow. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Mr. Peter Zeihan. Peter is a critically acclaimed author. His first two books, The Absent Superpower and The Accidental Superpower, have earned him worldwide acclaim. His latest project, Disunited Nations, became available in March of 2020. Mr. Zeihan is a highly sought-after speaker, and trade associations, Fortune 500 companies, and government agencies alike regularly rely on his expertise in trade and international affairs. Today, we are delighted to have Peter share his expertise with citrus growers. So without further ado, please join me in a warm virtual welcome. Peter, the screen is all yours.
Hello to everybody in California. Peter Zeihan here. I am coming to you from Colorado. We're in the midst of another snow dump. So if I lose connections with you midway through, don't worry, I will be back in seconds. I've already got my backup system set up. We're going to go through a lot of territory today. We're going to talk about the future of the citrus markets. We're going to be talking about some of your competitors and potential markets out there. But most of all, I want you to take away a single understanding. And that's that the rules of the game, as we understand them, as we have built our businesses for the last 60 years, the rules themselves are changing because the world has evolved beyond what we understand. So I'm going to try to shine some lights in the right places so that everybody can make some educated decisions moving forward. And with that, let's talk about how we got to where we are. The world that we understand is artificial. At the end of World War II, the Americans drew their allies together and said that we will patrol the global oceans for everyone, so that anyone can go anywhere at any time, buy any product, participate in any supply chain, and basically exist without need of a military escort. We just have one condition. You have to be on our side versus the Soviets. We created what we now understand as globalization and free trade to fight the Cold War. It was a bribe. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago, and we have been edging away from that ever since. It's not a Trump thing. It's not a Biden thing. It's not a Clinton thing. It's not a W. Bush thing. It's an American thing. And we are past the point of no return. Now, let's assume for the moment that you like globalization, that you want it to continue. Well, the question is then, what does the United States need to do if it wants to keep this system running? Well, I would argue that we need three things. First, we need global interests. We don't have that. The United States is the least involved economy in the world. As a percentage of GDP, we're just not there. In fact, if you factor out Canada and Mexico, we're half of what this even suggests. Who wants to be in the Middle East so the Chinese can import Middle Eastern crude? Just to kind of give you an example, it's not a popular sell. So economically, there's no argument to be made here. What about strategically? Well, the second thing that you need if you want to maintain a global system is you need boots on the ground. You have to keep everybody on the same side. You have to patrol the oceans. You have to keep countries from fighting. We don't have that anymore. This is total American troops stationed overseas since World War II. It's been trending down for decades. In fact, we now have fewer than 10,000 troops in the entirety of the Middle East. That number will probably hit zero this year. It's not that we've decided to leave. It's that we've already left. And what's left of globalization is simply running on inertia. What about the third thing? Well, global engagement requires a political system at home that has bipartisan agreement on America's role in the world. And while I personally would argue that that disappeared years ago, I think in the aftermath of January 6th, we all agree that we need a little bit of political retinkering here before we have any sort of big global plans. Now, let's assume for the moment that Biden is the guy, that he's the person who can bring us all back together, sing on the same page, read from the same page, put together a global plan that we can then go out and re-engage the planet. How long do you think it's going to take him? A month? His whole term? More time than he has left? Folks, this is a decade transition sort of stuff, and we haven't even started that process. So the United States, regardless of intent, is utterly incapable of preserving a global norm. That's the strategic side. That's the political side. Let's talk about the numbers. Let's talk about the economic side. Let's talk about demographics. What we've got here is a standard demographic profile. Children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Mortality tends to build it into a pyramid. Now, when we look at something like Mexico, American business leaders and American political leaders really like what they see, because whenever there's a bulge in the population structure, roughly below age 40, it's all about the spending on kids, on cars, on college, on homes. This is what drives most modern economies, the economic activity of the young. Now, this also is very complementary to the American political system and the American economic system. I mean, just think about the mechanics of this. When you're under 40, you're relatively new at your job. Your value add is not very high. Well, that means that the Mexicans are good at low and mid-scale manufacturing and assembly. That's not what the American workforce does. We do the high end, we do the design. So the propensity for integration between those two systems is massive. In addition, all those young Mexicans buy a lot of products. Most of those products come from the United States. Mexico became our top trading partner in calendar year 2019. They're kind of duking it out with the Canadians and the Chinese to maintain that position, but I have no doubt for the rest of our lives, the Mexicans are going to be at the top. This is a partner. This is not. The Koreans had a baby bust 50 years ago, and they never recovered. Now, they've got a lot of workers who are above age 40, in fact, in their late 50s, early 60s, folks who have been doing what they do literally for decades, very experienced, very high value added, going head to head with the American worker. We will never have a trade surplus with a country like Korea because there just aren't enough young Koreans to purchase the stuff that their workforce produces. It has to be exported, and a lot comes here. Now, from roughly 1980 to 2015, the world was at this wonderful demographic moment. All of the world's economies were either consumption-led like Mexico today, or export-led like Korea today. And because the United States was holding the ceiling up and allowing global trade to flourish, we had the biggest economic boom in the history of our species. GDP, personal growth, trade levels, all of them grew at record levels for 35 years straight. And everything was more or less in perfect balance. This is the ultra-globalized world that we all know. But it was just a moment in time. Here we've got a number of the major economies back in the year 2000. Looks great, right? But 20 years later, we are all 20 years older. The global demographic of high consumption was already ending on its own. And the export-led economies, they're all aging into mass retirement. The worst among them is China. Between the one-child policy and rapid urbanization, the Chinese population is in a state of collapse. They're now the fastest aging society in the world. And by 2100, there will be less than half as many Chinese as there are today, assuming nothing else goes wrong. Now, here in the United States, we are a partial exemption to this. Our population structure isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than everybody else's. And it's largely better because of this specific generation, the baby boomers. Now, in some ways, America's baby boomers are just like everybody else's, and almost every country in the world has a baby boomer cadre for the same reasons. World War II ended, the soldiers came home, they got on with their lives, and they had a lot of kids at the same time that cities really got big with suburbs. In that, the boomers do not stand out. Also, the boomers are aging into mass retirement on the same schedule as everybody else, and that's changing the capital structure. So think about how you invest your money personally. When you're 35, you put a very small sliver of a small income away for the future. When you're 55, it's a big fat wedge of a much larger income. And when you're 64 3/4, every dime you can spare, you put into your retirement account. As you age, the velocity of money increases, the volume of money increases, everything that you contribute to the system increases. But then the day after you retire, you never add to it again. In fact, you liquidate your stocks and your bonds and you put it into things like T-bills and cash because you can't take the volatility. So we get this accelerating, steepening curve of capital availability, and then it just falls off a cliff. Writ large, the baby boomers globally retire next year. We're only a year away now. That cliff is just in front of us. Now, in all of that, the baby boomers are the same. American boomers, Canadian boomers, German boomers, Japanese boomers, they all pretty much retire at the same time because they were all born at the same time. But our boomers, America's boomers, did one thing different. They had kids. And say what you will about the American millennial generation, and there's so much we can say about the American millennial generation. They've got one thing going for them that most of their cohorts around the world don't. They exist, and they're providing consumption to the system now, and they will be providing investment in the future. They will save us all. Let me give you an idea of just how lopsided everything is and the scale of the challenge that's just around the corner. What I've done here is I've stacked up all of the GDPs for all of the consumption-led economies in the world. US, of course, is the biggest one in the game. Here's where we are as of the data from last year, and here's where we'll be in 10 years. We have a significant drop-off in what is potential global consumption. But here are the export-led systems. They age out. They almost disappear as a class. And so if you are selling food products to an export-led system and the export-led system all of a sudden no longer has income, you got to wonder how stable that market's going to be. Right now, we only have one post-growth system in the world. That's Japan. But 10 years from now, we have always known that the first half of the 2020s was going to be a consumption crash. Global consumption has already peaked. But global production and capital supplies are in the process of peaking right now as well. Global consumption, global production, global capital, doesn't matter which one you're looking at, none of them will recover in our lifetimes. And that was before coronavirus came along and sucker punched everyone. What we've got here is new cases of coronavirus on a 7-day moving average in per capita terms, so it's broadly comparable country to country. Anything that is above that double red arrow is at 5 per 100,000 per day. That's the level where epidemiologists say that you're not going to be able to root COVID out of your society without a mass vaccination program. The 6 countries on here are the world's 6 largest consumption-led economies. Now, for the advanced countries here, the UK, the US, and France, we know that we're probably undercounting our COVID cases by a factor of about 3. So, we're not just above that double red line, we're way above it. But we also know that the 3 developing countries on this, India, Mexico, and Brazil, are probably undercounting by a factor of 10, or in the case of India, probably undercounting by a factor of 30. India kind of stopped testing altogether. They think that they got herd immunity. That's not as good as it sounds. We'll get to that in a minute. But what this tells me is with the consumption-led economies of the world currently offline, it doesn't really matter what's going on in anything else, because if you're not consuming, you're not growing. If you're an export-led system, you really don't have anyone to sell to. So by the time the world bounces back from this, which isn't going to be this year for the world writ large, it's already too late. We're already in 2022. So folks, this is it. It's over. Most countries will never recover to the growth profile or the economic status that they had of January of last year. This is as good as it gets. Actually going to be quite a bit worse because coronavirus has evolved. We have a number of new variants that are coming out. The first one is out of the United Kingdom. The problem with that one is it's 50 to 70% more communicable. So I strongly suggest people stick with those masks no matter what your governor says, at least for the time being. Now, the coronavirus variant, this UK one, is likely to become the dominant strain in the United States within the next 2 to 3 weeks. It's already responsible for something like 70% of new cases. So it is coming very, very, very quickly. That's problem one. Problem two is the nature of the coronavirus vaccines, with one exception. Every coronavirus vaccine that is in circulation in the world right now, doesn't matter who makes it, it's a 2-shot formula. And everyone's prioritizing their older populations. Older populations around the world have problems with transport, with problems with finance, problems with dementia, and the chances of people missing that second shot are reasonable. It's not going to be the majority of folks, but it's going to happen a lot. And if you want to generate more mutations, you partially immunize someone. So we know that these variants we have, this is just the start. We're going to have more. Problem three is the South African variant. In addition to being slightly more lethal, it is cross-communicable with rodents. There are mice and rats in every city in the world. What that tells me is that coronavirus is no longer something we can get rid of. It will be with us forever, which means that we will all need to get booster shots forever. But the biggest problem I see in the short and midterm is the Brazilian variant. Now, in the Amazonian city of Manaus, has a population between 2 and 3 million. was one of the first cities to really get hit hard by the virus last year. Best guess is that by the end of our summer last year, some 3/4 of the population of the city had suffered COVID. Hospitals overflowed in stories that we've become a little inured to at this point. But then they achieved herd immunity and cases plummeted. But starting about a month ago, the hospitals started filling up again. It appears that the new Brazilian variant, at least in part, can bypass pre-existing naturally gained immunity. And that makes vaccination absolutely critical, because the immune response that your body generates from a vaccination is about 10 times as powerful as what you get from the natural gain process. So if you can get the vaccination, you're going to be safe versus this variant. But if you can't, it doesn't matter if you've had COVID before. So any country that cannot achieve mass vaccination by July is going to be facing a new wave of COVID that's at least as bad as the first. That's the entire developing world. That's all of Europe except for the United Kingdom. You add in the increased communicability, the reservoir species capabilities, and East Asia is going to have to face a new wave of this as well. And if you're a country that adopted or even achieved a herd immunity strategy, Brazil, India, Sweden, you now have to do it all over again. Now, for the United States, this is nearly in our rearview mirror. We'll talk about the vaccines here in just a second. But globally, this means we're not even halfway through the coronavirus crisis. Most of the developing world can't even begin vaccinations until next year. You add in the simultaneous demographic collapse of globalization, and the picture for anyone not in North America is fundamentally bleak. I'd like to introduce you to William Shakespeare. That's literally the dude's name, Willie Shakespeare. He's a British citizen. He was the second person in the UK to get the vaccine. The Brits have a way with PR. Now, there's not a lot of good news here, but there's a lot of great news. So, I'm going to take this for what it is. We've got 5 vaccines, the first 2 of which, Pfizer and Moderna, are the mRNA formulas. They are both in circulation in the United States already. We've got 3 others at various stage of approval and use. Of them, the AstraZeneca is a British one, very popular in the UK right now, starting to make the rounds in Europe. They haven't yet applied for approval in the United States. The Novavax one is likely to be the one that's most popular in Canada. They're trying to figure out manufacturing right now. It also has not applied for approval in the United States. And then the Johnson & Johnson one is a new one as of last week that has just started flowing into the United States. Now, there are a lot of differences of all of these, but there's a couple things to keep in mind. First, Pfizer and Moderna are mRNA formulas, and both of them require a freezer for distribution. And we're now to the point that like a normal commercial grade freezer works. They don't need dry ice anymore. Those are our primary vectors in the US. AstraZeneca in Europe, Novavax in Canada. Johnson & Johnson stands out from all of the others in that it only needs 1 shot. So once and done, can be stored in a refrigerator. So moving forward in the months to come, the J&J formula will be instrumental in breaking the back of coronavirus around the world, but they have to generate a couple of billion doses before we get to that point. Now, whenever you are presented with the option, you should take whichever one you can get. The data is different on all of them, but the studies were different on all of them. So it's not really cross-comparable. All of them in field trials have done very well. All of them in field trials have gone through the largest field trials we've ever seen in human history. So we know they're safe because so far about 250 million people around the world have gotten them, and not one person has a direct causal death caused from them. Some people are nervous about these, especially the first 2, because they perceive mRNA as new. It's really not. It's the basis of gene therapy, which has been with us for 30 years. And gene therapy's never killed anybody, nor has it turned anyone into a lizard person, nor has it changed your DNA and affected your ability to have kids or what happens to your kids. That's all just conspiracy theory crap. Now, some people are a little concerned that these came onto the market really quick, and so they're concerned about safety. I'm not. You got to look at how a vaccine is produced. 85% of vaccines historically don't work out. So it's a big financial risk to even try. Of the 10 years of the normal vaccine cycle, 7 years of that is just getting the financing. Say what you will about the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed took care of that in a phone call in an hour. Of the remaining 3 years, 2 years of that is decoding the genome. You guys have heard of the Human Genome Project, right? That was finished in 2003. Decoding genetic sequences isn't hard anymore. It's pretty basic science these days. So we decoded the coronavirus genome in 3 weeks. That remaining year is manufacturing, testing, certification. So we've compressed that 12 months into 10. Not all that much faster. So what about numbers? Well, in the worst case manufacturing scenario, assuming no additional improvements in manufacturing, assuming the Biden administration does not exercise any additional options for purchases, the United States is going to have enough vaccine in circulation, not manufactured, distributed by July 1 for the entire population. It's probably going to be significantly faster than that. We're probably looking at anyone being able to walk into most pharmacies or doctor's offices on demand in April and just getting the shot. So for the United States, this is nearly behind us. A little light bit of vaccine diplomacy will bring in Canada and Mexico, and North America writ large will have coronavirus in the rearview mirror in the third quarter. And with booster shots, we'll be able to keep it in the rearview mirror. But for the rest of the world, this is just the start, because it's going to take months to years for everyone else to get this. So we are looking at the North American economic bloc surging forward, probably with record growth, certainly in the second half of the year, maybe even coming into the second quarter, but only here. Now, somewhat ironically, the Trump administration has kind of set us up for an outsized success. Donald Trump prioritized 5 trade deals: South Korea, Japan, Mexico, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Now, these are the 5 that you want. Mexico is the developing world's best demography. It's a complementary economy. Canada is a cultural cousin and is integrated into our manufacturing systems. Japan and Korea are largely virus-free and stable systems. And the UK is being vaccinated on a schedule roughly similar to our own. If your goal was to reinvent the American trade relationships, it's already done. Because with the exception of the UK, these deals aren't just finished, they're ratified, they're implemented. Normally, rejiggering trade relationships would be a 3 to 10 year process. But because of coronavirus, we have already done it. Hard work's there. This is our new friends and family plan. This is the vast majority of our trade relationships. Now, what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to go into a couple of economic sectors that are kind of adjacent to agriculture, and then we'll dive into citrus with the rest of our time. So first up, finance. This is the private credit curve in the United States. And this represents all credit from all sources to all sources. Car loans, bank loans, insurance policies, stock market, everything. Well, everything except interbank lending. So the overnight window, that's not in here, but everything else. Starts at 2000. That bump in the middle, that's 2007. That's the financial crisis. We doubled total private credit in 7 years. Too much, too fast, had subprime, had a recession that knocked 5% off of headline GDP. Since then, we started growing at something closer to the century average, although you can see that little spike there at the end, that's coronavirus. Okay. This is our baseline. The bump in the middle is a double. Same data, but now we're looking at it in relative terms rather than absolute. But again, that bump in the middle, that's a double. Here's the European Union, or the Eurozone specifically. In the time that we doubled credit, they tripled it. Their crisis hit harder, lasted longer. Several countries, such as Italy, still haven't gotten back to where they were in 2007. And now because of coronavirus, they never will. Here's Greece. Yeah, 7-fold increase of credit in 7 years. Obviously, they had an economic collapse. GDP contracted by 60%. was probably going to go down by another 20% before all was said and done. But again, coronavirus has prevented that from even being a theoretical possibility. No recovery. Here's Brazil. Brazil's a hoot. For those of you who follow Brazilian politics, you know what I'm talking about here. They had a presidential election 3 years ago. It was delightfully nuts. They're the last two people standing who were finally running after the primaries. One of them campaigned from prison where he had been convicted of corruption. Not indicted, convicted. Love it. And the other guy at his last big public rally said that, the real problem with those Nazis is they're just too soft on their domestic opponents. Yeah. So this sort of spike, this is what would trigger a lost decade. That assumes you get the politics right, which Brazil is not. We should honestly just factor in 2 lost decades for the Brazilians at this point. The purple is India. Whoops. Oh, had a little animation error there. The purple is India, and the gray is Turkey. 2 countries who have yet to really get going on any sort of correction. They've already elected ethno-nationalist leaders to multiple terms, folks who use state resources to spawn race riots when they want to bump from their supporters in the polls. The big difference between the two is India, the purple, hasn't started their correction at all, whereas the gray, Turkey, has. Now, about 2 years ago, they started trying to rein this in a little bit, and as a result, we had an economic crash. And shortly thereafter, the Turks started invading neighboring countries. It was a distraction play. You should expect both of them to have extraordinarily combative foreign policies moving forward. Now, the red, that is China, and I need to bring that down for you. China is now the most overcredited country in human history in both relative and absolute terms. So we are looking at a broad-scale financial exposure in the wider world that makes subprime look like a picnic. And remember, subprime triggered one of the greatest economic collapses we had seen in recent history. So the scale of what we should expect in the wider world when it comes to financial stability is almost non-existent. Let's talk energy. The broader the bar, the greater the volume of crude that comes out of this or that place. The taller the bar, the greater the cost of producing it. Now, this is data from roughly 10 years ago. US shale is the light blue bar on the left. Back then, it was about 4 million barrels a day, which is, important, but not like, oh, look out. The United States was using 20 million barrels per day of crude at the time. So it moved to the needle, but didn't really change the game. But since then, we've had changes in how we manage finance and water and drilling and data, and this is where they were at the dawn of the coronavirus crisis. We had achieved net energy independence in the United States. Now, it's fallen back a little bit, but we're really only about 1 million barrels a day off of where we were at this point. And we have a frac log that's about half that. So honestly, from a functional point of view, we're pretty much back to where we were. What this means is the United States now has a source of crude independent of anything that happens in the entire Eastern or Southern hemispheres. And the US president has the capacity to shut off oil exports to keep it all bottled up in the North American market. We, as a country, will never have an energy crisis again, or at least until we run out of shale, which is like a century in the future. Now, there's more going on here just than crude. There's also natural gas. This is what I like to call the checkbook map. It's just the world at night. Every concentration of lights is a place where there's a lot of people who can pay their power bill. This is the most important city in the history of civilization. Marshalltown, Iowa, that's where I'm from. This is Bismarck, North Dakota, and this is not a giant block party. It's the Bakken oil fields. It's a shale project, and it's lit up because of a problem with transport. Now, oil's a liquid. You can put it into any sort of container. It doesn't have to be sealed, doesn't have to be pressurized, and you can move it almost any way you want. Barge, rail car, truck, you name it. But you can't do that with natural gas. You have to have a pressurized system to gather it, to transport it, and to get it to a point of use. And that point of use has to process it at the pace that it comes in because storage is almost impossible. It disperses otherwise. Now, here in the US, We have the world's largest and most distributed and most redundant natural gas system in the world, but we can't keep up with the associated natural gas that's coming up out of the shale oil fields as a byproduct. So it gets dumped into the system at below cost. Based on whose numbers you're using, upwards of half of the natural gas produced in this country is sold at a loss. Well, what can't you do with the bottomless supply of the world's base material? Well, we burn a lot of it for power, and it's now our #1 electricity source. But we've also rejiggered our entire chemical system, and this is where you guys come in. If you start at the bottom left with crude oil, you refine that to get something called naphtha, and eventually you use that to make daughter products. If you start at the bottom right, the light gray bar with natural gas, you crack it to get ethylene, and you use that to make daughter products. Now, normally, you would only use natural gas to make this relatively narrow product set because it's difficult to work with. There's a 5-to-1 price difference between natural gas and oil normally, but not here. In the US, because of the shale projects, the price differential is closer to 2-to-1. So we have retooled our entire petrochemical system to run on the stuff wherever we can. Why does this matter to you? This is fertilizer, and this is pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. Good luck growing citrus without those things, which means in the United States, not only are we oil self-sufficient, so we don't have to worry about prices for crude or diesel getting jacked up. The things that we use for our inputs in everyday life, and agriculture in particular, actually use a different feedstock that the rest of the world doesn't have access to. So the next time there's a global energy crisis, and there will be one, not only does the United States not experience the sort of shortages and price increases that the rest of the world is just going to have to get used to, we use a different feedstock for the stuff that makes our systems run in the first place. So you can have stable prices for all your inputs here, where everyone else, it's high and erratic. Now, there is a problem, and that's agriculture. Now, the United States is largely divorced from the rest of the world's economic systems, but agriculture is the exemption because you guys are just too damn productive. Roughly 1 out of every 3 to 1 out of every 4 calories that we produce, it has to be exported because we just can't consume it all. Which means that if other countries want to target us in trade talks, they always go after agriculture because it's the only point of vulnerability. What I've done here is I've laid out a number of products by the percent that has to be exported. And as a rule, the further you are to the left, the bigger the problem. But there's some subcategories here that are worth calling out. Anything that is in red is a specialty product that has a very geographic concentration of where it is exported to, which makes it incredibly vulnerable to trade pressures independent of anything else. These are ones that I'm really worried about. Anything in gray is a product where the overcapacity that is built up in the American system has taken years, and the correction to a export volume that's a little bit more realistic is going to be really, really painful. You'll notice that pork specifically is in both categories. And then, of course, we've got citrus in the yellow. Fairly low on the scale. Not generally considered a specialty product. Now, that doesn't mean that your future is painless. It doesn't mean that you're immune to trade pressure. But it does suggest that the economic and structural pain that you will face in this transition period is going to be manageable. Because if you think forward to a world where supply chains break down, where diesel prices go up, where fertilizer is harder to get, most producers in most of the world, in most crops, are going to face extraordinary challenges. But not in the United States. Our entire supply chain runs on different things, and it's domestic. So our output is going to be stable, assuming that the market supports it. In your industry, I think you're going to be okay. I want to talk about some of your competitors and some of your target markets. This is simply the major exporters in terms of sheer bulk. Oranges first, then soft citrus, and finally lemons. The countries that really matter moving forward, I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about the deltas, the places where the change is going to be really robust and a little nightmarish based on your point of view. For those of you who are in the world of lemons, I probably have the least good news for you, because your primary competitors, Argentina, Chile, South Africa, they're probably going to be sticking around for a while. They don't face nearly the geopolitical pressures of most of the players. But if you are in soft citrus or oranges, your primary concern is Egypt and Spain. And the short version is they're screwed. We'll fill that out a little bit here near the end. But your primary competitors are probably going to vanish from the market. Let's start with the big boy, of course, and that's China, which is hoovering up whatever food they can get from anywhere. Now, there are 30-odd reasons why I don't think China is going to be a unified nation state just 10 years from now. We've already talked about demographics a little bit, but let's talk about strategy. The problem that the Chinese face are the islands off the coast: Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. It's not so much that they're all anti-China or that they're US allies or that they get along well with one another, although all of that is true. The problem is that they form a barrier between China and the rest of the world. The Chinese call it the first island chain. And there is no period in Chinese history where the Chinese have ever been able to penetrate the chain in a commercial manner and sustain any sort of economic integration with the wider world, with one exception: today, under American strategic sponsorship. The American Navy is probably 30, maybe 35 times as powerful as the Chinese Navy, and it can sail the ocean blue. China only has about 50 ships that can sail more than 1,000 miles from the coast. They can't maintain the trade lanes that they would need to in order to maintain their economic profile without American active assistance. So all the US has to do, if the goal is to destroy China as a country, is go home. That assumes that China can hold together internally. Now, the tan area on this map is what we consider a normal, temperate climate that has enough of a winter chill to kill some bugs and enough of a summer growth season in order to make things agriculturally possible, and enough rain that doesn't all have to be irrigated. Now, it looks like China has a lot of that, but most of it is in this northern section. Now, northern China is kind of unique from the American point of view in that there's no internal barriers. Everyone can pretty much go anywhere. But the river system is erratic. You certainly can't transport things on it. And what that has meant is for the last 3,000 years, it's been impossible for the Chinese to consolidate this region in any sort of meaningful way, because you can always have some government somewhere that kind of is off on the corner. And by the time you get over there to forcibly assimilate it into your system, you have another problem over here. So Chinese history is a history of civil war and genocide until very, very recently, until the 1950s. And so northern China has a very different mindset than the rest of China. This is where the militarists come from, the politicos, the folks that are like, China unity, China unity, China unity. That's all they care about. Economics are a distant second. Now, in the center, you've got something very different. The Yangtze is one of the world's great rivers. It's navigable for about 1,800 miles, which is on par with the Mississippi, although it doesn't have any of the tributaries. And the reason that matters is moving things from A to B on water is about 1/12 the cost of moving them on land. So whereas you get all these militarists and strategists in the north who are always worried about military cohesion, in the center you get the industrialists and the financiers and the traders and the manufacturers. This is the China that we think of when we think of an industrial powerhouse. And it's real, but it's not all of China. It's just one river basin. And then finally, you've got a section in the south that's in the tropics. That's the green. Now, the tropics are, great for a vacation, but they're not the best place to live, because when you don't have a winter kill, you get fungus, you get bugs, agriculture is difficult, and the people get infected with all kinds of tropical diseases all the time. It's bad for health. Southern China is also on the other side of a very rugged topographical region of several hundred miles thick from the rest of China. So this area has always been the last part of China to be incorporated into any sort of overall Chinese nation. So militarists in the north, industrialists in the center, secessionists in the South. There's a reason why Hong Kong is where it is. Now, the way you get everybody in China to be on the same page, there's two things you do. Number one, you beat the crap out of anyone who steps out of line. The Chinese are very good at that. And second, you bribe everyone to be on the same side. You throw bottomless supplies of capital at any sort of economic project, not if it makes sense, not if it'll make a product that somebody wants, not if it'll build a bridge, but if it'll employ people. Because if everybody has a job, no one's rebelling against the central government. And so if any time the Chinese actually suffer recession, the whole system's likely to fall apart. So they have basically adopted an Enron-style finance structure to keep everybody ungainfully employed. Remember those finance numbers from earlier that were way up? That's what this looks like on the ground. But it's not the same everywhere. What we've done here is we've broken down how China grows by the three different categories of growth. The first is consumption-led. That's Mexico. That's the United States. That's the purple in this map. Just two provinces, one of which is the capital. So it's like you wouldn't expect Washington, D.C. to be export-driven, would you? It just consumes. That's Beijing. Second, export-driven. We think of China like this, but it's really not. It's just the blue. It's not that exports are unimportant elsewhere, but they're certainly not the main driver. The third category is loan-driven. That Enron strategy, that's the yellow. That's a lot bigger. In the orange, loans aren't just the number one source of growth. They are bigger than exports and consumption combined. And in the red, those loans are more than exports and consumption combined and doubled. Whoops. That black circle, that's where all their citrus comes from. So you have an economic system you're competing with that is part of a secessionist part of the country and is among the least economically viable sectors that they've got. Agriculture writ large in China is one of the most subsidized systems that they have. And if anything happens to the capital structure, the whole thing implodes. All right, let's talk Egypt. This is a proto-orchard on the edge of the Nile Valley. There's a lot of things that look like this in Egypt. I wasn't able to find an actual citrus one. These, of course, are date palms. You can see that it's dry. I don't know if you knew this, but most of Egypt is desert. And deserts are dry, and citrus needs water. So the question is, how do you get the water to the orchards? Pretty basic, right? Here's a graphic that I stole from my former employer that I produced when I was there about 10 years ago. Anything is green has water. Pretty simple, right? All that water comes from one source, the Nile. There is no rain in Egypt, ever. Well, not in the last 3,000 years anyway. But check out this zone here. You see how it's a different color? This is the post-industrial new territories that the Egyptians have settled. Back in biblical times and really right up till 1980, everything in Egypt was pretty much done by hand. So if gravity and manpower did not allow you to irrigate a zone, it did not change from brown to green. It stayed brown. But post-1980, they built out some water pumping infrastructure, and using everything from electricity to diesel, they were able to lift the water higher up out of the floodplain and into these new territories. Here's a zoom in on the western side of the Nile. The coastline there is Alexandria, for those of you who are familiar with the area. You can see the very stark difference in color between the main Nile Delta and these new settled lands. All Egyptian citrus production, all of it, is on these new reclaimed lands. All the reclaimed lands in Egypt is above the floodplain. All of it requires irrigation. All of that irrigation requires electricity or diesel. If there is any issue in Egypt at any time with social cohesion, with government central control, with electricity supply, or with petroleum supply, and the entire system collapses. How long can citrus trees last if they can't get irrigation? You guys know the answer better than I. Egypt is one of the most politically unstable places in the world. It is one of the countries most dependent on the current globalized order, because when they started going into specialty crops, when they started doing citrus, when they started doing cotton, they stopped growing wheat. If they, for whatever reason, cannot maintain output, they lose the currency gains, the currency sales that they need in order to buy wheat on the international market. So everything that you might be concerned about from Egypt will go away in the next 5 years. They will not be able to keep this going. The situation is not quite as bad for Spain, and to understand that, you need to kind of look at the demographic picture. So what I've done here is I've built a graphic that compares youth to retirees. So the lighter your blue, the more young people you have. The more you get into yellow, orange, and red, the more older folks you have. And if you're red, you have something like 1.5 times as many retirees as you have young people. Now, here in the United States, we have a whole lot of blue. Demographically speaking, the United States is a young country. In fact, we only have 4 states where we are actually have more older folks than young folks, and Maine, West Virginia, Florida. These tend to be places where the young people leave relatively quickly, or the old people are coming in. So it's about what you would expect. Here's the United States, and here's Europe. Remember, blue and green are good, orange and red is bad. What this tells me is that Europe writ large has ceased functioning completely as what we would consider a normal economy. Consumption has collapsed across the entire Union, which means they have kind of a South Korea demographic structure, and they have to export to make things work. Europe, the EU in general, cannot survive in a world without easy access to consumption-based markets, which means that the United States was edging towards a trade war with the European Union, regardless of who won our elections back in November. Now, for you guys specifically, the big sticking point is something called the Common Agricultural Program, which is basically a subsidy regime in order to keep farmers on the land. It's been a sticking point in trade negotiations with the United States for quite literally decades, and Spain in particular is the number 3 recipient of CAP funds. For citrus specifically, it comes out to $100 million per year. Spanish citrus is also wildly dependent on being able to sell to the rest of the European Union writ large, which requires the Union to be intertangled, intermeshed, under treaty law, and having someone to export to. So all the changes that we are seeing in the global environment are deadly to the European Union in its current form. And whether they decide to cut the cap in order to have a little bit extra cash to throw around, or the common market just fractures under the pressure, it really doesn't matter. Any possible path from this point forward is very, very bad for agriculture in Spain in general. And they certainly don't have the capacity to make it work without external support from the rest of Europe. So whether or not there's a trade war or a trade deal with the United States, it doesn't matter, because support for citrus will go away. We'll close out with a few thoughts here. First of all, give you an idea of things to look for moving forward. First of all, we have our first stimulus package coming out of the Biden administration. It's in front of the Senate right now. It'll probably go back to the House within a few days for approval. It will certainly be implemented before the end of this month. And nor is this the end of it. There'll probably be a second supplementary package later in the first half of the year. So just get ready for that money to be coming in. If you haven't already reached out for a little of assistance from your lobbyists, now would be a great time. Second, the Russians and the Americans are butting heads in a very big way. We are opposed on energy policy. We are opposed on human rights policy, democracy, cyber theft, you name it. And the big change from the Biden administration compared to the last 12 years is that we're not exposed anymore. It used to be that the United States refrained from doing anything too direct against the Russians because we were wrapped up in NATO and we didn't want a nuclear war. We were wrapped up in energy markets and we didn't want to trigger any sort of global catastrophe. Well, that's not the case anymore. Under Trump, we basically removed ourselves from NATO. So you can have strategic blowback from the Russians that doesn't hit the United States. And the shale revolution has run its course, and we are now net energy independent, which means that if you have an energy shock that's Russian triggered, it doesn't affect us. So expect the Biden administration to throw all kinds of sanctions on the Russians for all kinds of things and to specifically target the energy sector. And that will crush the prospects for a lot of countries around the world, but really have no impact on North America. Speaking of energy, let's talk about Iran. The Iranians are facing a lot of problems right now. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign succeeded in shattering the Iranian economic system. They really can't export much crude anymore. And without the money that comes from those crude sales, they have a hard time supporting their paramilitary groups throughout the broader region. So the overall Iranian strategic picture is the worst that it's been in 40 years. In that environment, the Biden administration would like to have a new nuclear deal, but they don't just want to dust off the old one. They want to start over and get a new deal with better terms that reflects the strategic changes. Iran, of course, thinks that's an awful idea. And so they've started trying to get leverage over the United States. Problem is, they don't have any, and they really can't get any. Around New Year's, the Iranians went out and hijacked a South Korean chemicals tanker in an effort to get some political chips that they could trade away. Trump did nothing. Biden did nothing. We just don't care, which means that the Iranians don't really have much choice but to try to amp it up and grab bigger ships. But that's a problem for everyone else, not for us. The country that would face the biggest problem from that is the world's largest oil importer, China, a country that lacks the military capacity to get to this region in the first place. Fourth, this is Katherine Tai. She's the U.S. Trade Representative. If you don't know her now, get to know her very well. By some measures, she's wildly underqualified for the job. The Trade Representative is responsible for negotiating every trade deal we have. Tai has never led a trade deal. She's never even managed a large bureaucracy. So she really is coming in with no experience. But honestly, that tells me everything I need to know about the Biden administration's trade policy. There really isn't one in the traditional sense. With the possible exception of the United Kingdom, we're not even considering having a new deal with anyone in the United States. What Katherine Tai is a trade litigation lawyer. She sues countries who violate the spirit and the letter of American trade law. We're going to sue everybody. Now, if you want Katherine Tai to sue someone on your behalf, try to get as far up on her list as you possibly can. She's going to be a very busy beaver because the U.S. thinks everyone violates the letter and the spirit of American trade law. So it's just a question of who gets in first. Fifth, the Biden administration has said all the right things about Europe and re-engaging with the world, but the Biden administration has also made it very clear that it expects America to be back and leading the world, but it's going to do so without any money and any troops. Yeah, that's not how that works. In reality, the Biden administration is actually very hostile to Europe in particular, because under Barack Obama, the United States asked the Europeans for two things: troops for Afghanistan and stimulus spending to help recover from the 2007 crisis. Europe gave nothing. Biden remembers that. And so I expect relations with the Europeans to take a very dark turn very early in the Biden's term, certainly this year. And by the time we get to the second half, where the US economy is recovering, but Europe's not, expect that trade war. And then finally, China. Things are going bad on both sides of the relationship. On the Chinese side, we've seen that what economic growth they had last year wasn't from consumption, and it really wasn't from exports. It was from inventory build. It's very Enron. I mean, we've seen this movie before. Asia in 1997, 1998, that big crisis, had the same sort of start. The Chinese demography is sharply terminal. The Chinese Politburo knows that their economic model is collapsing. And so they're closing ranks, they're demonizing outsiders, and they are trying to enact a broad-scale political purge in preparation for a broad-scale lockdown. They know they face an economic challenge and maybe even an economic collapse. So going into a dictatorial political system is their way of holding the center. Will it work? Too soon to tell. But if you're from the outside world and you have an economic relationship with the People's Republic, it's time to get out. And that's just that side. On our side, Donald Trump threw a couple of grenades into the relationship on his way out the door. One, he called what was going on in the western province of Zhejiang a genocide because it's a genocide. And second, he said that any American bureaucrat or diplomat could go to Taiwan at any time in their official capacity as an American representative, which is like that far from formal recognition because, Taiwan is an independent state. The Biden administration also doubled down on every tariff and every sanction that Donald Trump started on. That includes sanctions on the Chinese equivalent of Chevron Texaco, as well as Huawei. We also now have new policies on Tibet, on Hong Kong, and Biden, within his first week on the job, ordered 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to do freedom of navigation sails through the South China Sea and actually carry out military exercises within sight of the Chinese military emplacements. And then, of course, there's Catherine Tai. In addition to most of her professional experience being suing China, she's ethnically Taiwanese. The Chinese perceive this as a full court press. They're not wrong. And any American businessman who thinks that they can carry on business as usual in a country that now Democrats and Republicans have both condemned as genocidal, think again. This relationship is probably going to end this year. That doesn't mean there aren't any bright spots. If you're looking for places to sell, there still are a lot of opportunities. What this map is it highlights every country in the world with a positive demographic growth story, as well as sufficient access to oil that they can keep the lights on. Anyone in green, anyone in blue. The difference between the green and the blue is that the countries in blue, from a security point of view, are secure, and the countries in green are likely to face some significant security challenges, whether it's internal or external. You guys are all familiar with the Mexican drug war. You know how nasty that gets? Mexico's blue, indicating it's safe, just to kind of give you an idea of where the threshold is. Now, there's a few stories within this. First, the Western Hemisphere, particularly Mexico, that's locked down. That's a good story. Very few security problems, and because of American shale and American finance, you should expect this region maybe not to continue as it has, but to have a pretty positive growth story moving forward. Second, Southeast Asia. You guys do face some tropical competition down there, but the real story for Southeast Asia is that this is a region that has been so fractured by geography with mountains and jungles and peninsulas and islands that it's never really gone to war with one another. So as the global rules break down, there's not a lot of regional animosity that could boil up into something bad. They're also broadly self-sufficient in all the industrial inputs that are required for them to industrialize and maybe pick up some pieces from China along the way. One thing they don't have enough of is food. This is a very urbanized region. And one thing that everybody who lives in a city has in common is they have to import their food from somewhere else. It's likely to be, after Mexico, our second largest growth in sales for agricultural output writ large moving forward. And then third is South Asia. It's kind of separated from a lot of the geopolitical hullabaloo, and India by itself is almost 1.5 billion people. So even if it just holds steady, maybe gets 1% growth, that's still a relatively robust growth story in the aggregate, especially in the world that we are moving into. Okay, that's a lot. If you're looking for a little light reading or something heavy to throw at somebody, here are the 3 books. Disunited Nations is the new one. Big takeaways. 1, globalization isn't ending. It's already over. Number 2, the COVID recovery is almost upon us, but only for North America. For the most of the rest of the world, there won't be a COVID recovery. And 3, your import-export competitors' markets is going to get a lot more simplified in the years to come. And most of the countries that are likely to be your long-term customers are looking actually pretty bright. And most of your major competitors are not. So That's everything from me. If you're looking for someone to follow on Twitter, that is my handle. Newsletter comes out erratically based on global events in my schedule. You can sign up for it there. And that is everything from me. I think we still have some time for some questions.
Okay, sorry for the delay there, Peter. That was excellent. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the audience right now. They're probably a little bit in shock, but we really want to open it up to the audience for some questions and answers. So there's a chat box there on the left-hand side of the screen. So if you have a question for Peter, please put that in now. We got about 10, 15 minutes to talk through a few questions. Peter, I want to talk about maybe one thing or ask you a question on one item I know we talked about in the past, but one of the critical items for the citrus industry and critical cost is labor. And the costs there continue to escalate. And you know, we've been working hard with our government. We've been trying to pass immigration and legalize immigration, have a better system moving forward. And that's been a challenge. We had, you know, the first bill that passed Congress last year, and now it's been reintroduced. But I know you look at these numbers worldwide, but can you talk a little bit more about labor and maybe give us some recommendations on what we should be doing with that forecast on labor?
Sure. So the labor situation, it's a global problem. We've had drops in the birth rate even in the least industrialized countries in the world. We don't think of, for example, as a place like Yemen for being an industrial powerhouse, but they have sewers now, they have electricity now, they have urbanization now that we had a century ago, but they're going through it more quickly than we are. So the whole world is urbanizing and moving towards smaller families that are started later. That cannot be undone on anything except for a multi-generational time frame. In the case of Mexico, their birth rate started dropping 20 years ago. Net migration from Mexico has now been negative for 11 years. It will not recover in the next 20. Central America is only 5 years behind. So the Central American caravans, we might have those for another 2, 3, 4 years, and then they will stop as well, just because there won't be enough people. So the traditional methods of getting labor into tree fruit industries, they're not going to work much longer. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep pushing, because, you know, there's a big difference between it happening tomorrow and it happening 4 years from now. But you already need to start planning for something else. There's really only two options. Number one, and I realize that this is not politically easy, maybe not even politically possible, refugees. Sponsor refugees. But you can imagine what it'd be like for the industry to sponsor 100,000 Syrians coming over right now. Just the political mood specifically couldn't support it. But that's really all that's left. Second is automation. One way or another, you are going to be facing fewer capable hands at a higher cost. And as we've seen in every other sector that had to wrestle with this, automation is really the only way to square the circle. I realize the technical complications. I realize the capital complications. And I would just underline that calendar year 2021 is the final year of relatively low cost lending. So do it now.
Thank you. The first question from the audience that we got is related to the cargo container issue that's happening right now, and them actually going back empty. Could you comment a little bit about what's going on with you see with China and the containers?
Well, three things. Number one, this is going to sound a little weird, but, you know, we can't accuse China of not being a market economy and then being annoyed when they actually use market means to get what they want. They paid more for the containers to get them earlier. I realize that's not something you want to hear, but that's true. Second, it's not a stable trade relationship anyway. We know that the overall relationship with the Chinese is going to probably collapse this year. So that specific problem, insufficient containers, that's probably going to go away real soon because the volume of trade is going to collapse. Third, it's time to diversify the trading relationships anyway, even if China was not becoming increasingly hostile and increasingly unstable. Mexico obviously is the largest place to look to that's close. but it is time to get along very, very well with the Southeast Asians. In every American agricultural sector that has gone to Southeast Asia to try to find friends, they've been pleasantly surprised with how warm the welcome has been. Thailand is a logical starting point because it's one of the more developed countries, but it still has 65 million people. Vietnam has blown most American agriculturalists away at how friendly they are to everything that we do. And all you have to do is mention that you don't like the Chinese very much, and all of a sudden you're going to be a godparent. They're also, the number one consumer per capita of pork in the world, and everything that Americans export food related is something that they want. They are industrializing, they are moving off the farm, and they are having more income that they can spend on things like food. So there's a replacement market there that is friendlier, that is more stable, and that will be with us for the long haul.
You actually touched on our next question that we had from the audience was, do you foresee Biden's trade policy growing markets in Southeast Asia to absorb the inevitable loss in China? Do you think it can actually overcome the losses in China moving forward in the future, or is it just going to be sort of a little bit of an off-ramp to help out a little bit?
Well, that's kind of three pieces in one. Number one, no, I don't expect the Biden administration to lead this charge. Biden has made it very clear for months now that he has no intention of launching any trade talks until coronavirus is firmly in the rearview mirror. Now, while for the United States, that will happen in just a couple of months, I have a feeling that he's going to interpret that a little bit more strictly, and he's going to mean the world writ large. So you're talking 2023, probably before he would start. And by that point, the China relationship will be gone completely. Number two, whether or not Southeast Asia can replace China. The more economically successful Southeast Asia is, the more it urbanizes, the more it gets into manufacturing, the more food it's going to need. So the long-term growth path is robust, and the stuff that they need now is significant, and the more problems that other agricultural producers in the world have, the more room there will be for American stuff. But if you're looking for a straight one-for-one replacement, it's not going to be that neat. Remember, because of China's financial model, flood everything with capital, they are not cost sensitive. And everything that China does, from building roads to building superconductor fabrication facilities to importing food, is not cost sensitive. So the type of growth story we've become used to with the panda boom isn't based on economic reality. So it exploded and then it's going to implode. But the Southeast Asians are not like that. They run on a financial model that is much more similar to our own, where if you take out a loan, you actually have to pay it back. Wild concept, which means that any sort of growth in the trade relationship is by definition not going to be as meteoric as what we've seen with the Chinese, but it also means it not only won't go straight up, it also won't go straight down. So it's one of those that the sooner you get in there, the sooner you make the connections, the sooner you can start redirecting trade flows. And whoever gets there first, obviously, is going to build the personal relationships that the Southeast Asians really, really appreciate. And again, Thailand, Vietnam, those are the two big ones to go after. And if you don't do it soon, the Australians and the New Zealanders will beat you. Now, there's obviously not perfect crop overlays, but I don't know how many Australians and Kiwis you guys know, but they're like ridiculously friendly. They're like us without the mood swings. Everybody loves them. So get in early, bring a fruit basket, bring a lot of bourbon, make friends.
Our next question comes from my friend and colleague, Mike Sparks, out of Florida Citrus Mutual, and he's really concerned about Mexico. He says, do you believe that Mexico production of fruits and vegetables, especially citrus, is going to be detrimental to U.S. citrus growers?
There's certainly going to be competition. Remember that the Mexican system, two things to be concerned about. Number one, it's not as stable. They don't have the water resources that we have in the United States. And they don't have the capital that's necessary to do irrigation on the scale with the reliability that you guys have in California. So it's not that I want you to talk you out of being concerned there, but it's not an equal production scale. So take that for what it is. Second, much bigger concern. The cartels have largely taken over citrus distribution in Mexico, right up to the border. How we wrestle with that in the bilateral relationship, we have no idea. This is something that was completely ignored under both Trump and under Obama. I have no idea if Biden's going to take it seriously. So far, the relationship between the US and Mexico under Biden has at least gotten off on the right foot. Not nearly as rocky as the start after the last two presidents. But this is not just an economic competition issue. The cartel that is most involved in citrus in Mexico is the Sinaloa, and they're getting their asses handed to them by some of their competitors militarily. So they are focusing more and more and more on distribution and a presence north of the border. And that will bring them into your backyard. So if you don't have a good relationship with the FBI, you might start edging in that direction.
Our next question is, what do you think California's outlook in the next 25 years looks like for agriculture? What are some of the most important adaptive tools that small and mid-sized farms need to focus on? What's the future for agriculture in the near future?
I have two bits of bad news, one of which will turn into a bit of good news for you. While agriculture is the economic sector that foreigners can pressure the most, it is not the only economic sector in the United States that is internationally linked. Tech manufacturing is just as exposed as you guys are. So what happens is Silicon Valley designs something and then it's built in East Asia. That entire relationship is going to implode, which means that Silicon Valley needs to build an entirely new manufacturing model. It can be done, and it can be done here and in Mexico, but it can't be done overnight. So California writ large is going to face a significant economic challenge in this deglobalization process. That will probably be of a net benefit for you, because all of a sudden the attraction of going to the coast isn't going to be there, and it'll be a little bit easier to get and hang on to your labor. So take that for what it is. I'd say that the biggest problem that you guys are facing, in addition to labor, is going to be water. And there's no way around that. Even after the last drought you guys had, you still haven't finished your basic water census. So some of the things that were done as a matter of course in Texas in the late 1800s, California still hasn't started on, which just blows my mind for in a region that is so dependent on moving water from A to B and irrigation in general. I don't have a good solution for you. You already do drip irrigation. You don't have a lot of open trenches. You've already done a lot of the basic stuff, especially after the last drought. But at some point, there needs to be a rationalization of how California manages their water resources. And if agriculture does not lead that process, you do not want LA doing it, because you know where that'll take it. So front load that as much as you can.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Peter, I want to thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. I'm sure you've got everybody in the audience sort of really thinking, and you're going to have conversations in coffee shops for a long time to come. So,
and we're going to be able to go to them soon.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much for your time here today. I know you're going to stick around and listen to our next session, which is our grower panel. Led by our chairman, Matt Fisher. But before we transition, I just want to say a final thank you to our keynote sponsor, Farm Credit West.
Thanks to Farm Credit, and thanks to you guys. Take care.
Bayer Crop Science is proud to support the CCM Citrus Showcase. We are also proud to support California citrus growers with our many crop protection products registered in citrus. We at Bayer would like to thank all the growers that have continued to support us through the years. At Bayer, it is our goal to provide best-in-class customer service to all our customers. On behalf of Bayer, thank you and enjoy the showcase. Bayer, science for a better life.
The My Ag Life Daily News Report is the go-to daily ag news source for California agriculture. The hour-long daily news report can be heard every Monday through Friday at 5 a.m. and is available on demand with the My Ag Life app. Download the app at myaglife.com. Each episode features interviews with growers, consultants, researchers, and industry leaders, as well as daily agriculture news that is important to growers on the go. A special segment called My Ag Life in Citrus appears every Tuesday. It features exclusive content created specifically for and by citrus growers and allied industries with an interest in California citrus. This segment will be developed in a partnership between JCS Marketing and California Citrus Mutual. Subscribe to the Daily News Report at myaglife.com or by downloading the MyAgLife app to play in your truck or other farm vehicle while on the go.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Fisher, and I'm the current chairman here at California Citrus Mutual. I want to welcome you to our grower panel, the portion of our discussion today. Most of you or some of you may have been in Visalia with us a year ago when we had our marketing panel. It was early March last year. We had four various marketers and packers that were there talking about 2019. Which was the worst year we've experienced in probably the last 20, 25 years. We were following that up with an equally disastrous season of 2020, and then COVID hit. And once COVID hit, we got a nice lift in demand, a nice boost in FOBs, and it was a big lift, which gave us a decent season in 2020 to finish up. Here we are in March of 21. Where are we going? We just heard a lot of interesting things from Peter in his presentation. So we decided to put together a grower panel to let you hear from growers rather than marketers. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have Jim Finch with Finch Family Farms out of Ojai. Jim's been a former board member here at Citrus Mutual, and he's going to be representing the District 2 growers. We have Brian Newfield, the president of Newfield Ag here in Exeter. Brian is also an executive committee member here at Citrus Mutual, and he serves as the vice chairman. And then we have Mr. Keith Watkins, the vice president of farming for B Sweet Citrus. Keith is also an executive committee member and serves as our secretary treasurer. So thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. First topic I'd like to kick off is I want to get your thoughts on what you just heard from Peter. Pretty challenging, insightful things for us to chew on. I know we're just digesting all of it. So, Jim, I'm going to start off with you. Give us your reaction to what you just heard.
Well, as you said, it was a lot to digest. And unfortunately, what I have to digest is a little different than what he said on the orange side. We are facing the Argentinian competition and other competition from south of our borders that is very real and fairly new to us in lemons, and it specifically hits at that midsummer Ventura County D2 timeframe. So we know we have competition, and we've been facing it for the last few years, but it sounds like it's only going to get worse in according to Peter. Export wise, as you saw, lemons were under 10%. So our threat domestic has been where we've been at in the last few years, and that's where our challenges are. He nailed our input cost challenges, water, labor. We face all the same as you, but unlike your intro of you had a terrible 19 and was looking like a terrible 20 that then turned better because of COVID, we had a bad 19 and then a worse 20 in the lemon side. COVID didn't give us the lift. It gave us the closing of restaurants and food service and hit lemons hard. So last year was one of our worst years in a decade or plus.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. You're right. When we're talking about perspective here, the various growing regions and the districts and the restaurant shutdown has a lot to do with it. So I appreciate your view on that. Let's go ahead and move to Brian. Brian, what are your thoughts on what you just heard?
A lot of times we give financial consideration to our growing costs of labor and inputs, fertilizer, chemicals, things like that. what I heard from Peter was something I hadn't considered much before, which is what our competing countries' issues are. And very interesting to talk about the future of the petroleum business and how that will impact these these other countries in a negative way, where we may be sheltered from those things. He also touched on automation. So I know we have, as a ag business, collectively have worked towards replacing some elements of human touch into farms. The idea that we can continue to focus on evolving our automation and in the field will, I think, will give us an advantage as well. And then the last thing is, as an orange grower, our goal is to get into these foreign markets like China and Korea. And if that's not the future of where we need to go, and Southeast Asia and Mexico as our trade partners, that seems to open up some new opportunities for us.
Yeah, well said. There's a lot to tease out here as well. I agree with you. So thank you for that, Brian. Keith, what's your reaction?
Well, I think my first reaction is we spent a lot of time over the last 10, 15 years trying to build that China market. We've done a lot of market access and worked with importers over there to get our products over there. And we've tried to grow a better product to get there. And hearing that the market's going to implode in a year makes me a little concerned. We do have other opportunities. We're seeing other opportunities in export in Southeast Asia and some of these developing countries, but we have put a lot of time into China, and that's very concerning. It was also interesting talking about fuels and our fuel independence that the U.S. has gone to. I agree with him that we're making great strides. I have concerns in places like California where we have a tendency to talk about minimizing our carbon footprint and not being able to use carbon natural gas as one of our tools. So there is some differences between where our future is and probably the rest of the country's future is, but here in California being able to do that.
Yeah, well said, Keith. I had similar thoughts as well when it came to the energy front. I think a lot of what Peter said, for me, it's good to get knocked upside the head from an outsider, right? And make us think a little bit differently about where we're going. I too, everything that we do on the naval front is centered largely on China, and we do know that China has been going away. That we've had a lot of problems with China the last few years with the Trump administration and some of the tariffs that were going on. But what we don't know is, where does that go from here? Where are we going? And some of the things that Peter was able to introduce to me today was, some of these other factors about, growing region in China and what's going on with them producing their own fruit. That actually gave me some hope and encouragement that maybe China might stick around to buy our product longer than maybe what Peter's projecting. On the flip side of that, that seeing the credit issues going on in China blows my mind. I mean, when you see that off the scale like that, how much is artificially being held up? And I have larger concerns about how much of China owns the U.S. debt and how does that play into all of this, but that has nothing to do with the citrus industry. So, and then the comments in the Q&A on the labor front, that's not anything that we don't know. We're witnessing all of that. All of us are struggling on this labor front. The use of more H-2A labor has been more and more prominent in the last 3 to 5 years. And the cost of that is more, obviously, than the cost of labor here. So validated a lot of things I think that I already knew, but also raised some real concerns about, back to the question of what do we plant, right? Where are we going? What varieties do we put in the ground? What works domestically? What can hold export-wise? We'll talk about that more in our next segment. So all in all, I was challenged like probably everybody else. So Thank you guys for your comments. Any other, Jim or Brian, any other final thoughts, or Keith, that you want to wrap up on that?
One comment that I'd never even thought about when you speak of labor was his comment on refugees. I mean, that just never crossed my mind. But the political challenges are great.
Yeah, certainly. All right. Well, let's move to our second topic of discussion. And now that we have heard these things, and we're in the midst of everything that I talked about, the District 2, the lemon growers are struggling, right? We got high wind events that keep knocking the heck out of Ventura County, Kern County navels. So that's climate related stuff. We have the import issues with Argentina on the lemon deal, South Africa's imports that are coming in. As a grower, what do we need to do? Where do we go from here? And that's the second topic conversation, or question that I'd like to ask. I'll go ahead and start with Brian. Brian, give us your take on how do you see this as a grower going forward?
Well, look, I'm just coming at this from a grower production's point of view, not in the packing house, not in the marketing side. So all I know is, on the farming front and working to pay attention to what's happening within our industry and our business, and look for trends as to who's buying what as far as fruit goes and what the market wants. That's where I focus my energy and time, is to try to produce a product that fits well into the market, because I don't have any control over these other aspects of it. So that's I think that when we look at growing fruit, our goal is to grow fruit that has as few imperfections as possible. We're trying to grow fruit that meets a size or taste or a size requirement, and that's primarily my focus.
So what's your message to growers, Brian, in terms of what do you want to challenge growers with that are watching this, and in terms of that focus?
Well, I think just this discussion as a whole as to where economies are going into different countries. Like you mentioned, we try to move oranges into these export markets like Korea and China, and there's certain things that we have to do to get there. So I think the challenge is to continue to pay attention to how things are moving forward, and how you as a grower are going to have to follow right along with it. And you may have to make some changes to either your farming operation or the types of products that we're growing.
Yeah, you bet. Good. Okay. Well, thank you. Just a quick side note, we're going to have a Q&A session after this. So if there's some things that are popping up in your mind, there'll be a chat box that you can submit your questions to when we get there. Next, we're going to move to Keith. Keith, give us your perspective as a grower. What are some of the things that growers need to maybe consider that they haven't heard today?
Well, I think we as growers have to do what Brian's saying. We have to have the best quality fruit and have that fruit fit into the market that's there. We have traditionally tried to grow citrus trees 50, 60 years, some longer. And, as we all know, as they age, the quality drops off. And we end up with a lot of small size fruit, poor quality fruit. And the market is just not accepting that anymore. A lot of money has flowed into our industry because we've been successful over the last 15 years in bringing, in creating revenue. And now we have to compete with all this new acres that are in the ground, stronger trees, newer varieties. The mandarins are competing against our standard orange. I still think a California navel orange is one of the best pieces of fruit that we can provide to the world and to our domestic consumer. But we have to give them a quality product. The days of we'll send the off-grade fruit to domestic and export all the fancy stuff doesn't work anymore. our marketers, our retailers that we deliver to, they want a quality piece of fruit. So taking out an old Frost New Cellar block and old TI blocks because we just can't grow size, most years on them, needs to be done. We need to bite the bullet, reinvest in our blocks, and have quality fruit. I'm a victim of that also because we have not been as aggressive in our company as doing that. Well, we should have. We still have a lot of those trees, and we're trying to basically make those changes now. And you want to be diversified. You want to be able to go into, if you've got the right, ground, have some lemons, have some mandarins, have some navels, have some specialties, but don't overplant in any one item. Growers have to be careful. I've ridden the blood orange market up and down too many times to know that you can make good money until you produce one too many, and then it doesn't sell. So that's my thoughts on the industry.
Good deal. Thank you, Keith. You mentioned something about outside money being in this industry. There's been investor groups and large venture capital type money that have been around this industry for a very long time. It seems like with the threat of inflation and everything going on with what we're doing about printing money right now, there might be a larger move this direction to put money into real estate and agriculture. Can you speak a little bit to that in terms of what we as growers can do to maybe not compete with that money, but what are some of the things that we can do to continue to make ourselves viable?
And it's a tough question. There's a lot of pension money that's basically flowed into this business. They've bought up a lot of operations. They've got the capital to invest in new orchards and the varieties, but they also need assistance from growers also. And we have to be able to kind of look at what they're doing, but also make our own decisions and move away from that. I think there's value in having them, they help hold our land values up. They bring sometimes political assistance to us in certain markets. So it's not a bad thing having. It's just that they are competition, and we have to continue to be there with them and hopefully have a common voice as we try to work through our issues.
Yeah, very good. All right, Jim, you referenced some different items and challenges that Ventura County growers have. Where do you go from here? If you're a Ventura County grower, you obviously have significantly different issues than we have here in the San Joaquin Valley due to population, water, so on and so forth. So where do you go from here as a grower?
I don't know if they're significantly different. They might just be a precursor. We might see things a few years before they make it into the valley, because our issues and answers are the same as what Brian and Keith were referring to. Older trees producing smaller fruit and lower quality. But I think a lot of people have HLB in the back of their mind down here, and with good prices, they were trying to get those trees to last them until the HLB solution was figured out, whether it was a tree or something. And so some of these groves have been left in longer than what they should have been because of that threat of HLB. And I was thinking before this, I don't think we have any citrus grove down here that is probably much more than 6 to 7 miles from a city, and it's not necessarily a big city, but it's a city. And the ability to get backyard trees sprayed, it's not good at all. So we have ACP. You can find it when we have flush, you can find ACP in most any grove, and even right after our sprays. So it's something always in the back of my mind, along with, labor and water. And most of Ventura County relies on Mother Nature. There's a few parts of the county that are connected to some state water, but very little. So we need Mother Nature to cooperate. And this year we're looking at somewhere between less than 30% down to 20%, depending on where you are in the county of our normal rainfall. So we've got both, pressures from Mother Nature, disease, and our own government in some cases working against us. But the answers are the same as what Keith said. Young trees that produce high quality fruit with bigger yields.
How do you work around the population issue? You mentioned orchards being within 6 to 7 miles of some type of population, right? And up here in the San Joaquin Valley, we're a little bit more fortunate that we have more rural areas, and we don't have that population infringing in on us. As a grower in Ventura County, how do you work around the difficulty of the amount of sprays that you have to do because of this pest and disease issue?
It has become more and more challenging. Part of my lexicon has become the ag-urban interface. And in several instances on ranches I manage, the nearest house is about 30 feet away or 40 feet away, whatever it is, across a street. And I have groups of people that I text every time we're spraying because they want to be notified when we're doing any kind of spraying, even weed control work. It is a very challenging relationship. They want the agriculture for the green open space that it delivers, but they don't want the nuisance that it brings. And it's a balance that was accepted in the past, but new neighbors are not as accepting of what they move next to, and it's very challenging sometimes, adversarial actually sometimes.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you. So here's my thoughts. We've heard a very common thread with all three guys here, and that is old, tired legacy blocks. And we've heard the problems. We've heard the problems from Peter. We know our own problems and what they are. We have trade environments that are shifting. We have domestic consumption trends that are changing rapidly with the onslaught of social media, Food Network, YouTube. There's an overabundance of information that the consumers have now, and they're shifting their eating patterns, the diets, the Amazon deliveries, which hasn't even rapidly taken effect at this point. All of this is going to change the domestic consumers. You also have costs. In the last 10 years, our farming costs are going up. They're up 75% in 10 years. And that's without all these other issues that Peter referenced, right? In that same time frame, our harvest costs, which most growers don't pay attention to the cost of harvest because they're buried in our pool statements and the pack analysis pay those on our behalf. That cost is up 60% in the last 10 years. So our costs are soaring. We've got Sigma, we've got the water issues that we know really well. Even Peter referenced them in the Q&A session. So what are the solutions? The solutions are we have to move away from the legacy blocks that are no longer viable. There is a certain amount of product that could fit into the pipeline that is our domestic consumption and our export consumption. And the bottom line, we heard this a year ago, and the same thing still stands today. COVID or no COVID bump that we were able to enjoy. We have to redevelop and retire these old blocks. We as growers, we cannot get upset with a packet house for not picking us when we feel we need to be picked. And if you have that attitude, you are going to continue to get pushed. Your block, your fruit's going to get held on the tree. Look at this year as a prime example. We're enjoying some better pricing, but we're slow. How many of you are waiting to get picked? I know I am. And we have issues relative to timing of harvest. And what happens when you store the fruit on the tree for longer than what we think it should? The quality starts to degrade, and then we have problems. So my message and my challenge to growers, whether you're in Ventura County or Riverside or anywhere in the state, the San Joaquin Valley, do your part and redevelop. Because if you don't, the natural forces of market dynamics are going to drive these FOBs back to the $9 and $10 range on navels, and we know where that ends up. We're going to go broke that way, or we're going to get in front of it and we're going to do our part to help alleviate the oversupply problem. Now, what do you plant? That's $1 million question that if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be sitting here. You have to pay attention. You got to ask the right questions. You got to work with your packers, your marketing people, talk to people, try to understand what works, what best. And a lot of us have jumped on the Mandarin bandwagon in the last 20 years because they're quick to come into production, and we like that, right? I'm a part of that same camp. But we've got to be strategic. We've got to be long-term thinkers about what we're doing. So diversification of varieties. I hear from growers or from various people, well, I'm a small 20, 30 acre grower. I can't afford to diversify. That's not true. Whether you're a 30 acre grower or a 300 acre grower, you have to diversify. Because if you're sitting on a TI navel block that produces 50 bins an acre, but your quality's poor, you're toast. You're done. I don't want to sound like Peter, but you're done before you even know it, right? And some of us get that extra lift like we had in 2018, which kind of gives us that boost to where we think, oh, we can hang on just one more year. The message is simple. Change is happening now. It's not coming, it's here. And we have to do what we need to do to continue to redevelop and diversify. And I know it costs money, but we're fortunate that we have land that we can loan on. And if you have to go to your bank and get it done. So that's my overall message to the group. At this point, we'll open it up to Q&A. There's a few questions that have popped in here. I'll try to work through these best we can. First question, as growers, do you have a greater interest now after hearing Peter's presentation and participating in USDA or CDFA trade missions? I'll give that to Keith.
I think we have to continue to grow our markets overseas, and really sometimes growers speak the best for us. So I don't think it's a bad thing to do. It's a time-consuming thing to do. And I think we as an industry, we need to be doing it. We have sometimes it's us as growers, sometimes it's us or our representatives like CCM to do that for us. But I support continuing to build those markets. Yes.
Thank you, Keith. Our next question is, retailers are consolidating and gaining more leverage over our pricing. What can we do to combat that and keep prices at sustainable levels? Give that to Jim.
Well, I think down here and up there, and in my involvement with my main marketer, Sunkist, it is true that as we fragment, that we create our own competition. And while I do think competition is important to a degree, I think we need a core nucleus of good, strong marketers. We've seen the same thing in the avocado industry. It's a half dozen or so good, strong marketers. The small person, just all they can compete on is price, and they're not doing anybody any favors other than that, maybe that one grower that they're dealing with. I think sticking with the main marketers is key for all of us.
Yep, very good. Okay, next question. Our marketers told us last year that we had too much fruit and some acres needed to come out. Do you agree with that? I'll take that. I think the message has been clear in this grower panel anyway. The answer is yes on certain varieties, and it's up to you as a grower to figure out what varieties those are. We certainly, if you are not getting picked in the time frame that you think you need to get picked, and then your fruit's falling apart, and by the time that the packing house shows up to pick you, then likely you've got too much fruit, and we need to continue to reduce acreage. Like, I don't want to be super negative here. You drive around the country and there's a lot of orchards coming out, and that's a good sign. It's a good thing, because the more poor quality, I'm speaking navels specifically here, the more poor quality navels that come out, we're that much closer to reaching that equilibrium point of where we need to be for better sustainable pricing. All right, next question. What are the mitigation strategies for a low water availability year? Keith, I don't know if you want to tackle that.
Yeah, it's really not my specialty, but I think we're we have to look out there and find out what our water is going to be this year. I mean, I know Friant came out initially with a 20% allocation. That's not going to get the job done. That's going to push us to rely on our groundwater here. Those are with Sigma is going to be a challenge over the next few years if we try to get our basins in sustainable. I think the key is we need to. I think there is some studies out there on deficit irrigation after fruit set that have shown some promise, but you need to work with your agronomists and figure out the best way to utilize what you've got. And this is another reason why poor growth should come out. It may allow you to put the water you need to put on your good growths. We have to make some hard decisions over the next few years.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in on this one as well. My answer to that would be redevelop into the higher profitable varieties. And I hate to keep pounding that drum, but if you have grows that are profitable, that you're making money on, you have the ability. I mean, in low water years, sometimes you got to buy your way through it. You got to buy your way through paying $1,200, $1,400 an acre foot on water. And we all witnessed that just 6 years ago, right? It was it was a painful time. And I know growers that decided not to do that, and I know growers that did do that. And the guys that did do that, they recovered quicker. The growers that did not, it took them longer to recover. So make that part of your strategy as you're looking at this redevelopment, this 5-year plan of where you're going. You're gonna, until we get through the next 15 to 20 years on Sigma, you're gonna need the ability to buy up and allow this thing to stabilize, because it's the Wild West right now in this water world. So that's the one thing that I keep coming back to. So, all right, one more question here. Zach Rissell says, or has a question about, can the panel talk about the role of technology in the future of farming? I'd like each of you to touch on this. I'll start with Jim.
Technology in farming. I think we're already employing a lot of technology. The technology that I think we're all waiting for. And I've worked is probably overstating the fact. Talked with the gentleman who has invented some of the celery, lettuce, vegetable harvesting machinery, and they've been able to cut their harvest labor by 60% to 70% in some cases. And he's taken hard looks at citrus, and it's really just deploying the labor in a different fashion. Nothing towards robotics. It's the one step forward, and that's all that they've done in vegetables also. That, to me, that's where our biggest labor cost is at. The on-farm labor, I think we can deal with. And unfortunately, our irrigation systems down here, be it coyotes or other varmint, they have to be checked by a human every go around. So I'm not that hopeful there, but harvest is the one place where I would love to see something happen, and I'd be happy. And I think most of the growers down here would work with anybody that could help us with it.
All right, Keith, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree with Jim completely. There's a lot of technology that we're utilizing from some of the deficit irrigation through using pressure bombs and monitoring systems for our irrigation, and drones to look for stress in the trees. But the key we have to do is we have to automate our harvest. And being on the Citrus Research Board is one of the drums I beat all the time. Is we need to to finance people that are willing to work on finding a better way to do harvest. I agree with Jim. It's not completely robotics. It's not, it's steps. Let's get some picking platforms out there. Let's eliminate the ladders, eliminate the bags first. Get it to the point where they can do the job easier, and then we can use fewer people and maybe work longer days with them, and it benefits everybody. Those are the steps. But I think eventually robotics may be the answer, but it's much farther down the road. We've got to continue to work towards that. But I'm a strong supporter of taking that first step towards assisted harvest platforms that we need to be working with.
Well, very good, guys. Thank you so much for your time. I want to wrap this session up by just saying to the audience that's watching, look, our hope and is that you'll take this information, you'll chew on it. These are our opinions, of course. You're going to have your opinions that might differ from where we're coming from, but digest this, really wrestle with it. And we don't mean to be harsh or sound harsh, but we want to be real about where we see things are, where they are in the industry today. If you want to talk to each or one of us about our thoughts, feel free to reach out here to Citrus Mutual's office. They'll get you in touch with us. CCM's been a great place for growers to come together to educate yourselves on what's going on politically, what's going on, in all aspects of the industry. So please utilize Citrus Mutual for that. And the last thing I want to reiterate is change is here. I said that earlier. It's not that it's coming, it's already here. And what are you going to do as a grower to do your part to help us alleviate some of the negative effects of where we are and where we're going? I really believe that if we come together as growers and we do that collectively, we have a very, very bright future in front of us. We grow some of the finest tasting fresh citrus anywhere in the world in one of the greatest agricultural valleys anywhere in the world. So don't sell yourself short when it comes to your ability to make this happen. So before I go, I would be remiss to thank our marketing sponsor, Bayer Crop Science. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to have this presentation today. Them, along with Farm Credit, they have been tremendous partner to not only Citrus Mutual, but also the citrus industry. So thank you to the folks at Bayer Crop Science for your generous donation. At this time, I'd like to kick it back over to Casey. And again, thank you for joining us today.
On behalf of all of us at California Citrus Mutual, thank you for attending the 2021 Virtual Citrus Showcase. We hope today's event added valuable perspectives that will help you navigate the future with more clarity. A special thank you to our keynote speaker, Mr. Peter Zeihan, our grower panel, JCS Marketing, and all of our sponsors for making this event possible. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all in person soon.
We would like to thank our sponsors for their participation in this year's meeting. Bayer Crop Science, Farm Credit West, Aerobotics, Agri Financial, Fruit Growers Supply, Guardian Harvest, Nicino America, Nielsen Insurance, Pace International, Actigrow, Sinclair, Semios, Suterra, The Zenith Agribusiness Solutions, My Ag Life Daily News Report,